Have you ever wondered why small words can hurt so deeply? Have you ever felt wounded even when nothing touched your body? Have you asked yourself who is suffering inside you right now? These questions stay with many of us for years. They trouble our hearts more as we grow older. They follow us like shadows we cannot explain. Welcome back to the Son.Mindfulness channel. I'm very grateful you're here today. Please stay with me until the end of this video. I promise it will touch something real inside you. Many people today feel lost inside their own minds. They feel tired of carrying old stories. They feel trapped by past wounds. They feel confused about who they truly are. Does that sound familiar to you? We live in a world filled with noise and pressure. We try to be strong every day, but something inside still feels fragile. Something still gets hurt too easily. Why does this happen? Why do we suffer even when life looks fine on the outside? Why do words, memories, or expectations hold so much power? These questions have followed humanity for centuries. They are not new, they are deeply human. Today we will explore a profound Buddhist insight, a gentle but powerful way of understanding the self. Not a theory, not a belief, but a way of seeing, a way that reduces suffering in everyday life. And this teaching matters to you. It matters because you deserve peace. It matters because you deserve freedom from unnecessary pain. It matters because life feels lighter when the heart understands itself. This is why Son.Mindfulness exists. Our channel shares wisdom for real life. We offer teachings that calm the mind. We explore ideas that heal the heart. And we walk this path together, one gentle step at a time. If you find meaning here, please subscribe to Son.Mindfulness. Your support keeps this space alive. Your presence helps our community grow. Before we continue, allow me to ask, what would your life feel like with less self-blame? What would change if criticism no longer pierced your heart? Would you like to discover a peace that stays steady inside you? If your answer is yes, you're in the right place, and I'm honored to walk this path with you. Thank you for being here today. I wish you health. I wish you peace. I wish you happiness and good fortune. Now, let us begin this journey together. Let us gently explore how the illusion of self creates suffering, and let us discover what happens when the mind becomes free. Part 1. The Inner Contradiction of Self. You know, my friends, as I sit here and look into this camera, I'm reminded of how often we all rely on a simple, familiar feeling, this sense of I. It's something so close, so intimate, that we rarely question it. From the moment we wake up, that sense is already speaking. I need coffee. I feel stiff today. I don't like what's happening in the world. For decades, maybe 70, 80 years, that feeling has been your closest companion. It feels solid, like a lifelong friend who never leaves your side. And yet, when we turn around and ask, very gently, what exactly is this I? The certainty slips through our fingers like water. I often share this question with older students who come to the temple. Many of them are in their 60s or 70s, and they've lived full lives, raising families, navigating loss, witnessing the world transform. One woman in her 70s once told me, "Teacher, I still feel like I'm 20 inside, but when I look in the mirror, the person looking back is a stranger." Maybe you felt that too. It's such a universal moment when the inner sense of self and the outer reality don't match, and we suddenly realize how mysterious this I truly is. I want you to imagine standing in front of a photograph of yourself taken 50 years ago. The smile is familiar, the eyes full of youth and possibility, and instinctively, without hesitation, you say, "That's me." But is it really? The body in that picture, every cell, every molecule, is long gone. The hopes and fears of that young person, perhaps they've dissolved, perhaps they've transformed into something wiser or gentler. The mind you have today is not the mind you had then, and yet we use the same word, me. Isn't that strange? Science even confirms this mystery. Biologists tell us the body replaces most of its cells every 7 to 10 years. Neuroscientists say the brain rewires itself throughout life. New memories forming, old ones fading. If someone showed you a list of your favorite things from 30 years ago, you might laugh and say, "I don't like any of that anymore." And still, we insist, "I have changed." But who is the I that changes? If everything shifts, the body, the personality, the memories, then what exactly is doing the changing? I knew a kind gentleman in his late 70s who once told me, "Teacher, when I look back at my life, it feels like I'm remembering someone else's story." And I smiled and said, "You're beginning to see what the Buddha pointed to, that the experience of I is real, but the entity behind it is unfindable." We feel continuity, but we can't locate a permanent owner of that feeling. It's a quiet contradiction we all live with. We say, "I'm not the same person I used to be," and in the same breath, "but it's still me." We hold on to both sides at once, never noticing the paradox. It's like trying to hold a flame and call it one thing, even as it changes shape every moment. So let me ask you gently, have you ever wondered why the you inside still feels familiar, even though everything else, your body, your memories, your roles, has changed? What is it that feels like you? Can you point to it? Touch it? Describe it? The Buddha wasn't trying to erase your sense of existence. He was inviting you to look deeper, to see that what we hold as a solid me is actually a flowing river. A river feels continuous as it moves, but no single drop stays. In the same way, your life has flowed from moment to moment, never the same, always becoming something new. And maybe, if we can understand this contradiction, not as a problem but as an invitation, we might begin to loosen our grip on who we think we must be. And in that loosening, the heart becomes a little lighter, a little freer. Part 2. Continuity without sameness, the stream analogy. My friends, I'd like to invite you to sit with a simple image today. Not something complicated, not something philosophical, just a small flame on a candle. Imagine you're holding that candle in a quiet, dark room. The flame flickers gently, warm but fragile, and you use it to light a second candle, then a third, then a fourth. Now let me ask you, is it the same flame moving forward, or is it a new flame each time? Most of us would say it's the same flame being passed along. And yet, the flame you see at the end shares none of the original fuel, none of the original heat, none of the original motion. It's connected, yes, but it is not identical. This is what the Buddha meant when he described human life as santana, a stream, a continuum. We are not fixed things. We are ongoing processes. We are the river that keeps flowing, not the stone that stays still. If you look at a river at sunrise and again at sunset, you call it the same river. But not one drop of water is the same. Not one line of current is the same. The river is continuous, but never identical. Human life is exactly like that. We feel continuous, as if there is a solid me going through time. But the truth is gentler, more mysterious. We are a flow of changing conditions, thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, appearing and disappearing moment by moment. Nothing about us stays the same from one breath to the next. And yet, the pattern is familiar enough that we think of it as me. I once spoke with an elderly gentleman, maybe in his late 80s, who said, "Teacher, when I look back at old photos I recognize myself, but I don't feel like that person exists anymore." And I told him, that's the river of your life speaking. We recognize continuity, but the substance of who we were is gone, just like the water that has flowed past the riverbank. Think about your own life. The child you once were, the one who ran barefoot, laughed carelessly, dreamed freely. Where is that child now? Are they still here? Or have they flowed into the person you became in your 30s? And that person, full of responsibility, ambition, worry, did they stay frozen in time? Or did they flow into who you are today? We rarely notice how life rearranges us. The grief you carried 20 years ago is not the grief you carry now. The love you felt in your youth is not the same love you feel in old age. Your fears, hopes, habits, beliefs, they shift like a stream finding new directions. There is continuity, yes, but sameness? Never. Modern science agrees with this ancient insight. Your body regenerates itself constantly. Your brain rewires its circuits every day. Your memories reshape themselves each time you recall them. You are not who you were last month or last year or even yesterday. And yet, when you wake up each morning, there is a sense of familiarity, like the river recognizing its own flow. But here is where misunderstanding creates suffering. We confuse continuity with permanence. We believe that because life flows smoothly, there must be something unchanging underneath. A true self. A fixed identity we must protect at all costs. The Buddha gently pointed out that this is not so. The flow is real. The pattern is real. But the permanent owner of that pattern is unfindable. So let me ask you, what happens when we stop demanding that life or the self remain the same? What happens when we allow ourselves to be a flowing stream instead of a solid object? Maybe the heart softens. Maybe reactions become smaller. Maybe forgiveness becomes easier, because we see that no one, including ourselves, is the same person from one moment to the next. In this way, understanding continuity without sameness is not just a philosophical idea. It's a doorway to compassion, a doorway to freedom, and a doorway to living with a little more ease, as we let the river of life move as it always has, gently, continuously, without ever needing to be the same. Part 3. How the sense of self creates division and suffering. My friends, I'd like you to reflect on something very simple, something all of us do without even noticing. We speak to ourselves as if there are two people living inside one mind. We say, I'm disappointed in myself. We say, I need to control myself. We say, I can't forgive myself. And when I hear people speak this way, especially older students who have carried many burdens through life, I gently ask them, who is speaking to whom? It sounds like a strange question at first, but the more you look at it, the more profound it becomes. Because hidden inside that one sentence, I'm disappointed in myself, is the belief that there are two versions of you. One that judges, and one that is judged. One that controls, and one that must be controlled. One that is good, and one that is not good enough. Imagine living your whole life with two characters constantly arguing inside your chest. One pushing, the other resisting. One blaming, the other shrinking. Most people don't see this as suffering because they think it's normal. But this division is one of the deepest sources of human pain. I once spoke with a man in his 70s who told me, "Teacher, I feel like there's a voice inside that is always disappointed in me, even now, after everything I've been through." He had raised children, survived illness, endured loss, worked hard all his life. And yet, he carried an inner critic that never grew old, never softened. It stayed sharp, rigid, demanding, and he thought it was part of who he was. The Buddha offered a different understanding. He said, there is seeing, but no separate seer. There is hearing, but no independent hearer. There is thinking, but no solid thinker behind the thoughts. This sounds subtle, but it changes everything. What the Buddha meant is that experience happens naturally, like waves rising and falling, but we create unnecessary suffering by imagining a little self behind the experience, pulling the strings, receiving the blame, carrying the weight. When you feel anger, the body tightens, emotions flare, and the mind reacts. But then another layer appears. I shouldn't be angry. Now there are two of you, one angry, one ashamed. Two waves crashing into each other. Let me ask you gently, how many times in your life have you suffered not because of what happened, but because of the inner conflict afterward? The event passes, but the self-judgment stays. The pain ends, but the story continues. The moment ends, but the identity remains. Modern psychology echoes this. Therapists now speak about the inner critic, the wounded self, the observing self. They've discovered what the Buddha taught 2,600 years ago. When we divide ourselves internally, we create anxiety, shame, and chronic tension. Not because life is unkind, but because the imagined self inside is always at war with itself. The Buddha's insight was that the war is unnecessary, because the two selves we imagine don't actually exist. There is only experience, arising, fading, changing, moment by moment. The voice that says, "I'm disappointed in myself," is just another thought, no more solid than a passing breeze. The feeling of shame is just another emotion, appearing and disappearing like clouds. When you see this clearly, something softens inside. You stop taking sides in an inner battle. You stop trying to fix yourself, punish yourself, control yourself. Instead, you begin to observe. There is disappointment, there is fear, there is habit. No attacker, no victim, just experience unfolding. And in that simple shift, from I am suffering to there is suffering, the whole inner landscape begins to change. A spaciousness appears, like a door opening. You realize you don't have to fight with yourself anymore, because the one who fought and the one who was fought against were never separate to begin with. This is how the sense of self creates division. And this is how seeing through that illusion begins to heal the heart. Part 4. Why the Buddha remained silent on whether the self exists. My friends, among all the questions that people brought to the Buddha, one stood out as perhaps the most delicate, the most profound. A wanderer approached him and asked, "Does the self exist?" The Buddha said nothing. The man tried another angle, "Then does the self not exist?" Again, silence. To many people, especially today, silence seems like avoidance. But in this case, silence was compassion. It was wisdom. It was a refusal to let the questioner fall into one of two dangerous misunderstandings. Misunderstandings that can lead us far away from peace. You see, if the Buddha had said, "Yes, the self exists," the man would have walked away believing in a permanent soul. An unchanging me, something eternal that survives unchanged through all of life. That belief is called eternalism. And if we cling to it, we spend our lives defending an idea of ourselves that can never truly be protected. We become rigid, fearful, unable to accept change, loss, sickness, aging. The heart tightens because it's clinging to something that doesn't exist in the way we imagine. On the other hand, if the Buddha had said, "No, the self does not exist," the man would have fallen into another misunderstanding, equally dangerous. He might have concluded that nothing matters, that there's no responsibility, no meaning, no moral foundation. This is nihilism, the belief that life is empty of purpose or value. And when people fall into this mindset, their hearts grow cold, their choices reckless, their compassion thin. The Buddha knew this would cause tremendous harm, so he remained silent. But this silence was not emptiness. It was direction, a gentle pointing, a reminder that the question itself was framed incorrectly. When the Buddha later explained this to his students, he said that both views, eternalism and nihilism, lead away from freedom. One traps you in the illusion of a permanent self. The other strips life of meaning. Neither brings liberation. So instead of answering yes or no, the Buddha offered something entirely different. The lens of not-self, Anatta. But let me be clear, my friends. Anatta is not a philosophical claim. It is not a theory to memorize. It is not a belief to defend. It is a practice, a way of looking. A method of observing your own experience with clarity and without clinging. Think of it this way. When you feel anger rising, the usual reaction is to say, "I am angry." Those three words fuse your identity with the emotion. You lock them together. But the Buddha invites you to try another approach. There is anger. Not my anger, not I am anger. Just anger is present. This small shift opens up space. The emotion is still there, but the I that used to collapse around it begins to loosen. You breathe more easily. You see more clearly. One of my students in his late 60s once told me, "Teacher, when I learned to say there is sadness instead of I am sad, it felt like I finally stepped out of a cage I didn't know I was in." That is the power of not self. When the Buddha taught, "This is not mine, this is not me, this is not myself," he wasn't telling you that you don't exist. He was showing you a way to stop clinging, a way to let go of the tight grip around each thought, each feeling, each fear. Because what we cling to becomes heavy, and the things we refuse to fully experience become the things that hurt us most. This is why the Buddha refused to answer the question. If he had answered it directly, we would have mistaken the teaching for a doctrine instead of a tool. He wasn't concerned with defining what exists. He was concerned with ending suffering. And for that, what matters is not whether the self exists, but how the idea of self causes us to cling, and how that clinging can be released. In this silence, the Buddha gave us a path, not a belief, but a way of seeing that leads to freedom. Part 5. How clinging, upadana, constructs the psychological self. My friends, if you sit quietly for a moment and listen to your own mind, you'll notice something subtle but powerful happening inside you. You'll notice how easily the mind takes hold of things, sensations, memories, roles, achievements, beliefs, and pulls them inward with the words mine or me. It happens so fast that we hardly ever see it. A pleasant feeling arises and we think, "I want more of this." A painful experience appears and we say, "This should not be happening to me." A belief forms and suddenly it becomes my belief, something we must defend. This act of claiming, of wrapping experience with a sense of possession, is what the Buddha called abhana, clinging. And this clinging, repeated thousands of times a day, builds what we call the psychological self. Not the physical body, not the personality shaped by genetics, but the story we carry about who we think we are. I once spoke with a woman in her early 70s who told me, "Teacher, I've spent my whole life being the responsible one, the one who holds everything together. Now that my children are grown and my career has ended, I don't know who I am anymore." Her suffering didn't come from old age or retirement or changes in her family. It came from losing the identity she had clung to. When the role disappeared, the self she had built around that role felt hollow, incomplete, even frightened. The Buddha understood this deeply. He saw that suffering arises when we take something temporary, an emotion, a thought, a success, a failure, even a spiritual experience, and we make it me. We weave these pieces together into a fragile self-image, and then we spend our lives protecting it. But because every piece of that self-image is unstable, the entire structure becomes shaky. It is like building a house on sand. Think about it. If someone criticizes your work, that's just a sound, just vibrations in the air. But if you've made your accomplishments part of your identity, then those words feel like an attack on you. Not your project, not your behavior, but your very worth. I've met many older students who carry decades of unhealed wounds, not from physical pain, but from threats to their self-image. A parent who once told them they weren't good enough. A teacher who embarrassed them in class. A job where they felt overlooked. Those moments stay alive because they were personalized. They became part of me, part of the story. The Buddha identified 4 main types of clinging, each one adding another layer to the sense of I and mine. Clinging to sensual pleasure, where we chase pleasant experiences and fear losing them. Clinging to views, where our opinions become extensions of our identity. Clinging to rituals or achievements, where we try to prove our worth through actions. And clinging to the doctrine of self itself, insisting that there must be a solid me somewhere at the center of all this. These 4 types of clinging act like threads. Together, they weave the fabric of the psychological self. A self we then carry around like a delicate vase, terrified that someone might bump into it and make it crack. This fear is not weakness. It is simply the nature of anything that is built on unstable ground. Let me ask you gently, how many times in your life have you been hurt, not by what happened, but by what you made it mean about you? How many friendships have suffered because pride said, "I am right"? How many opportunities were missed because fear whispered, "I might fail, and that would mean something about me"? When we cling tightly to the identity we've constructed, life becomes a battlefield. Every opinion becomes a threat. Every loss becomes personal. Every criticism becomes a wound. But when we begin to see clinging as a habit, not as who we are, something opens. The sense of me becomes lighter, more flexible, less afraid. The Buddha wasn't asking us to destroy the self. He was inviting us to loosen our grip on it, to see how the mind constructs I and mine, moment by moment. And in seeing this process, we discover a freedom we didn't know was possible. The freedom of not having to protect an identity that was never solid to begin with. Part 6. Pain versus suffering. Freedom arises when there is no me to protect. My friends, as we reach this final part of our reflection, I want to talk with you about something every single one of us has lived through: pain. Not just emotional pain, not just the heartbreaks of life, but physical pain too. The aching knees, the stiff back, the illness that comes with age. None of us escape these things. Even the Buddha did not escape them. In the ancient texts, the Buddha taught that pain, or Vedana, is part of having a body. If you are alive, you will feel discomfort. You will grow old. You will become sick from time to time. This is not a punishment. It is simply the nature of biological existence. But suffering, Dukkha, is something different. Suffering is what the mind adds on top of pain. Suffering is the story. This shouldn't be happening to me. Why is this happening now? What does this say about my life, about my future, about who I am? Pain is a sensation. Suffering is the meaning we attach to it. Pain is in the body. Suffering is in the mind. I once sat with an elderly man who had lived through many years of chronic back pain. He told me, "Teacher, the pain hurts, but the fear of the pain, that's what ruins my days." And I nodded because I knew exactly what he meant. The anticipation, the resistance, the story around the pain, those weighed more heavily on him than the sensation itself. When the Buddha spoke about this, he used a powerful image: the two arrows. The first arrow is physical pain, unavoidable. The second arrow is the mental anguish we add, completely optional. Most of us, without knowing it, shoot ourselves with the second arrow again and again. What creates the second arrow? The belief in a solid me who is being hurt, a me who must be protected, a me who feels attacked by life's difficulties. When we cling to this identity, every unpleasant experience feels personal. Every loss feels like an insult. Every challenge becomes a threat to who we think we are. But something beautiful happens when we begin to loosen this clinging. Life does not suddenly become perfect. Pain does not disappear. Aging does not reverse. But the mind becomes lighter, more spacious, less reactive. The Buddha described this state as akampita, the unshaken mind. A mind like a great stone pillar in the middle of a storm. The wind blows, rain falls, thunder shakes the earth. But the pillar does not move. This unshaken mind is not numb. It still feels pain, still feels sadness, still cares deeply. But it no longer collapses around experience. It no longer says, "This is happening to me." Instead, it simply knows, there is pain. There is sadness. There is disappointment. When we experience life in this way, the pain is still there, but the suffering dissolves. The experience is like watching waves rise and fall, without believing the waves are attacking the shore. They come, they go, they leave no wounds behind. I once spoke with a woman who had lost her husband of 50 years. Her grief was real, deep, and tender. But she told me, "Teacher, the moment I stopped saying I have lost my husband and started saying there is grief, something softened inside me. The pain was still there, but it wasn't crushing anymore." That is the difference between pain and suffering. When we stop building an identity around our experiences, when we stop making every emotion into a personal story, the heart finally has room to breathe. Pain becomes manageable. Challenges become workable. Life becomes livable again. This is not the cold freedom of detachment. It is the warm freedom of understanding. It is what happens when you no longer carry the weight of protecting a self that was never as solid as you believed. And in that understanding, in that gentle release, something remarkable appears. Not invincibility, but peace. A quiet, steady peace that no storm can shake. Conclusion. My dear friends, thank you for staying with me through this journey. Each part of this teaching carries a quiet wisdom. We explored the mystery of the self. We saw how identity shifts and flows. We learned that nothing inside us stands still. We discovered how clinging builds a fragile sense of me. We learned how this clinging turns pain into suffering. And we saw the freedom that appears when there is no self to protect. I want you to take a slow breath with me now. Feel the softness of this moment. Notice how your thoughts rise and fade. Nothing stays. Nothing holds its shape for long. Have you ever noticed this in your own life? How emotions come and go like passing clouds? How memories change each time you recall them? How the person you were years ago feels like someone else? Does that realization bring you comfort or curiosity? The heart becomes lighter when we stop gripping the self. Suffering softens when the story loses its weight. Life feels gentler when we stop taking every moment personally. This is the quiet gift of these teachings. You might ask yourself, what would my day feel like if I didn't cling so tightly? What pain could I release if I didn't turn it into a story? What freedom could I taste if I met life with openness? These are questions worth sitting with. They reveal more through experience than explanation. They invite practice, not belief. I want to honor you for listening deeply today. It takes courage to look into the nature of the self. It takes tenderness to question lifelong habits. And it takes wisdom to recognize even a small shift of understanding. You have already taken a meaningful step. Can you feel that? Do you notice something inside you relaxing, even slightly? If so, that is the teaching taking root. I invite you to carry these reflections into your daily life. Observe your thoughts gently. Notice your emotions without judgment. Watch how the sense of me appears and disappears. Let each moment show itself without resistance. These small moments of awareness create real change. They open the door to peace. They allow your heart to breathe again. If any part of today's reflection touched you, please share it. Tell me what resonated with your own life. Your stories help others feel less alone. Would you share a thought in the comments below? Is there a moment in your life connected to these teachings? Thank you for giving your time, your presence, and your trust. Your support keeps this space alive. If you feel connected to these teachings, please subscribe. Please follow the channel and stay with us on this path. Your support helps Son.Mindfulness continue sharing gentle wisdom. I wish you health. I wish you peace. I wish you happiness. May life open softly before you. May you be safe, steady, and blessed. Thank you, my friends. May you walk gently, and may freedom find you in the quiet moments.